The farmer looked her over and spat on the ground. "This land is ours. Your kind isn't welcome here." But when she calmly pulled a folded, official-looking document from her briefcase, the man's mocking smile vanished instantly. This story is about resilience and justice. If you believe no one should be judged by the color of their skin, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like this. And let us know in the comments what city you're watching from and one word that comes to mind, like justice or dignity. The story begins on a hot summer day in Mason County, North Carolina. Sarah Jenkins, a 38-year-old architect from Charlotte, was steering her SUV down the dirt road that led to her late grandmother's farm. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. The farmhouse, a white wooden structure that hadn't seen a coat of paint in 20 years, appeared at the end of the road. It looked smaller and more tired than her childhood memories. She parked the car and got out. The silence was almost total, broken only by the buzz of insects. Sarah felt a tightness in her chest. This land was her grandmother Eleanor's legacy, a woman who had held onto it with her bare hands for over 50 years. Now, it was Sarah's. Before she could even step onto the porch stairs, a dusty pickup truck screeched to a halt behind her car. A white man in his 60s, with a sun-beaten face and a tractor cap, climbed out. He walked toward her with an entitled stride. "Can I help you?" he asked, but his tone wasn't friendly. "I'm fine, thank you. This was my grandmother's property," Sarah said, her voice steady. The man let out a short, harsh laugh. "Eleanor's gone. We've been looking after the place since. Name's Silas Miller. My farm's just over yonder." He jutted his chin toward the other side of a barbed wire fence. "I know who you are, Mr. Miller. My name is Sarah Jenkins. Eleanor was my grandmother, and she left me the farm." Silas's smile faltered for a second before twisting into a sneer. "Look, miss, I appreciate you driving all the way out here, but this land is part of the Miller operation now. We've been using it for years. There's nothing for you here." Sarah's calm was a wall of steel. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. I have the deed. The property is legally mine." Silas took a step forward, invading her personal space. His voice dropped to a low, threatening rumble. "I don't care what paper you think you have. Black people don't rule here. This is a farming community. We take care of our own." Inside her leather satchel was a manila folder. It contained everything she needed, but she knew showing it now wasn't the right move. First, she needed to understand the depth of the problem she was facing. "You have 24 hours to pack up and leave," Silas said. "This is Miller land now." But Silas had no idea who he was dealing with, and he was about to find out that a piece of paper, signed and sealed, can be more powerful than a lifetime of prejudice. What was on that paper? After Silas left, leaving a trail of dust and threats, Sarah let herself into the farmhouse. The air was still and smelled of old wood and dried lavender, the scent of her grandmother. Every creaking floorboard was a memory. She walked to the kitchen and ran her fingers over the scratched oak table. This was where Grandma Eleanor had taught her to read, using the labels on jam jars and flour sacks. Eleanor was never one to complain. She was tough, born and raised on this very land. Sarah remembered the stories her grandmother would tell about the hard times, about neighbors like the Millers, who had always looked at the Jenkins property with greedy eyes. "They see our land and they think it should be theirs," Eleanor had said once, peeling peaches on the porch. "They think because we're black, we don't belong. But this land has our blood in it. Don't you ever let anyone take it from you, Sarah." That promise echoed now in the quiet of the empty house. This wasn't just about acres. It was about her grandmother's honor. Sarah opened her briefcase on the kitchen table. There it was, the deed clear and final, registered with the county clerk's office. There was also a copy of Eleanor's will and a recent land survey she had commissioned before she came. She was prepared. Meanwhile, at the neighboring farm, Silas Miller stomped into his own house, slamming the door. His son, a 22-year-old named Jake, was at the table fixing a piece of equipment. He looked up, sensing his father's anger. "Eleanor's granddaughter showed up," Silas growled, grabbing a beer from the fridge. "The one from Charlotte? What did she want?" Jake asked, wary. "She thinks she owns the place. Came in with her big city airs talking about deeds and laws." Silas took a long swallow of his beer. "I told her to get lost." Jake stopped his work. "Dad, you can't just do that. If the land is legally hers—" "Legally?" Silas scoffed. "We've worked that land for 5 years. We've planted on it. We've mended the fences. That makes it ours. She's just some city woman who wouldn't know a rake from a hoe. She'll give up and leave." But Jake didn't look convinced. He'd grown up hearing his father complain about the Jenkins wasted land. He'd also watched his father gradually move the fence lines, graze his cattle a little further each year. He knew what his dad was doing was wrong, but he'd never had the guts to confront him. "What if she doesn't leave?" he asked quietly. "Then we'll make her," Silas said, his eyes cold. His motivation was simple. He believed his family, as white farmers who had been in the area for generations, deserved more. He saw Eleanor's land not as her legacy, but as an opportunity he had a right to take. His prejudice was just the justification he used for his greed. Later that afternoon, Sarah drove into the small town. She needed groceries and wanted to get a feel for the local atmosphere. At Mason's Market, the only grocery store, people watched her. The looks weren't openly hostile, but they were curious and wary. When she got to the checkout, the woman behind the counter, whose name tag read Brenda, gave her a tight smile. "You new here, hon?" "I'm staying at my grandmother's place, Eleanor Jenkins's," Sarah replied evenly. The shift in Brenda's face was subtle but unmistakable. The smile vanished. "Oh, the Jenkins farm." She finished ringing up the groceries in silence. Sarah knew then that the Millers' influence ran deeper than their property line. The battle was going to be harder than she'd thought. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of an engine. It wasn't a car on the road. It was loud and close. She went to the bedroom window and looked out. A large red tractor, the Miller Farms logo emblazoned on its side, was parked directly in the middle of her driveway, completely blocking in her SUV. It wasn't a warning. It was a statement. Rage shot through Sarah, hot and sharp, but she pushed it down. Panic wouldn't solve anything. She picked up her phone and, after a brief online search, found the number for the Mason County Sheriff's Office. A bored voice answered on the third ring. "Sheriff's Office. Hello, my name is Sarah Jenkins. I'd like to report a trespasser, and my property is being blocked. I'm at the old Jenkins farm on Old Mill Road." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Jenkins, you said you related to Eleanor. I'm her granddaughter. The property is mine now." "Right. And who's blocking your drive?" "Silas Miller. He's parked a tractor in my driveway." Another pause, longer this time. "Okay, Ms. Jenkins. We'll send a deputy out to take a look." 45 minutes later, a patrol car crawled up the dirt road, stopping near the tractor. A heavy-set, middle-aged man with a droopy mustache got out. His uniform was stretched tight over his gut. He looked at the tractor, then at Sarah on the porch, and ambled her way. "Morning, Mum, I'm Sheriff Brody," he said, his southern drawl thick. "So, what seems to be the problem here?" "The problem is, there's a tractor blocking my driveway. I asked the owner, Silas Miller, to leave my property yesterday, and this was his response." Sheriff Brody took off his hat and wiped his brow. "Now look, Ms. Jenkins, I've known the Miller family my whole life. Silas can be a bit hot-headed, but he's not a bad man. He is trespassing on my property and intimidating me," Sarah said, her voice clipped. "That's against the law." "Well now, that's what we call a civil dispute," Brody said, avoiding her gaze. "Silas here says he's been using this land. You say it's yours. That's something you'll need to work out between yourselves, or maybe with lawyers. Ain't much I can do about a parked tractor." Sarah's disbelief was palpable. "You're telling me someone can just come onto my land, block my access, and the sheriff's office won't do anything about it?" "I ain't saying that," he said defensively. "I'm saying it's complicated. Best I can do is go have a word with Silas, ask him to move it. But I can't force him without a court order. My advice? You try talking to him again. Try to work things out neighborly." The sheriff left soon after. Sarah watched him drive over to the Miller farm, spend about 5 minutes there, and then drive off right past the tractor still parked in her driveway. Nothing changed. The message was clear. The law in Mason County was not on her side. The system that was supposed to protect her was tilted in favor of the people they knew. Silas wasn't just a bullying neighbor. He was part of a local network that saw her as an outsider, an intruder. That night, sitting in the dark of her grandmother's house, Sarah felt isolated, trapped on her own land. The frustration threatened to consume her. But then, she looked at the kitchen table where her briefcase lay. The sheriff had talked about court orders and lawyers. Silas thought he had her cornered. They were both wrong. They thought she was just some city woman who would scare easily. They didn't know she hadn't come for a neighborly chat. She had come prepared for a fight, and they hadn't seen her strongest weapon yet. Sarah's resolve hardened. turning from a defensive shield into a sharpened spear. Sarah knew she was on a clock. A major architectural project in Charlotte was entering a critical phase, and her boss had already called twice, his voice a mix of concern and impatience. She couldn't stay in Mason County indefinitely, living in a house with no internet and a blocked driveway. The isolation was a weapon Silas was using against her, counting on her city life to pull her back and force her to abandon the fight. The weight of this time pressure settled on her, but it didn't create despair. It created focus. She spent the next day taking inventory of the farmhouse, making lists of repairs, measuring rooms, her architect's mind finding comfort in order and planning. While walking the property line described in her survey, she found what she expected. The barbed wire fence was a good 10 feet inside her land, expanding the Miller pasture at her expense. That evening, as dusk settled, she saw a figure walking hesitantly up her long driveway. It was Jake, Silas's son. He stopped a respectful distance from the porch, holding an old canvas bag. "Mom," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "My dad, he had no right to do that. With the tractor." Sarah watched him, her expression unreadable. She said nothing. "I know you've got no reason to believe me," he continued, fumbling with the bag, "but I found these in the old barn. They were your grandmother's. Figured you might need them." He set the bag on the ground and backed away. "It's just some old tools, a hammer, some wrenches, nothing much." He turned and walked away without another word. Inside the bag, under a rusted set of wrenches, Sarah found a small hand-carved wooden bird, smooth with age. She recognized it instantly. Her grandfather had carved it for her grandmother a lifetime ago. It was a small gesture, but it was the first crack in the wall of hostility she had faced. It was a sign that not everyone in Mason County was her enemy. Her next move was to seek out allies, no matter how quiet. Following a hunch, she drove to Henderson's Hardware in town, a place her grandmother had always spoken of fondly. The store was run by Mr. Henderson, an elderly black man with kind eyes and a firm handshake. "I remember you as a little girl," he said, a genuine smile reaching his eyes. "You have your grandmother's fire." "I'm trying to," Sarah admitted. "But right now, I feel like I'm just getting burned." She explained the situation with Silas and the sheriff. Mr. Henderson listened patiently, nodding. "Silas has always been greedy," he said in a low voice, ensuring no other customers could hear, and his father before him. "They feel entitled, but Eleanor, she was smarter than all of them. She kept records of everything." He leaned closer. "The county council has its monthly public meeting tomorrow night. Silas will be there. He always is, acting like he runs the place. If you want to make a stand, you don't do it on your land where he has the power. You do it in public, where people have to listen." The information settled in Sarah's mind, connecting with the documents in her briefcase. An idea began to form, a bold public strategy. The ticking clock from her job no longer felt like a chain pulling her back to the city. It was now a countdown, a deadline for action. She had the tools, she had the place, and now she had a plan. The subplot of Jake's guilt and Mr. Henderson's quiet support were becoming intertwined with her main goal, not distracting from it, but strengthening her resolve. The pressure was on, but for the first time, she felt she could push back. Part 5, 812 words. The Mason County Community Hall was a brick building with a stuffy institutional smell. The air was thick with the scent of cheap coffee and decades of bureaucratic boredom. Sarah found a seat in the back, her leather satchel resting on her lap. She saw familiar faces from the grocery store. Sheriff Brody near the front and, as Mr. Henderson predicted, Silas Miller, sitting in the second row like a king holding court. The meeting droned on. There were discussions about road repairs and a zoning variance for a new feed store. Silas spoke twice, his voice booming with the confidence of a man who believed his opinion was fact. He portrayed himself as a community leader, a hard-working farmer concerned only with the town's welfare. Sarah watched, her patience a coiled spring. Finally, the council chairman announced the public comment period. "Anyone wishing to address the council, please come to the podium." Sarah stood up and walked calmly to the front. A murmur went through the room. She adjusted the microphone. "Good evening, my name is Sarah Jenkins." Her voice was clear and steady, cutting through the low chatter. "I am the new owner of the property at 144 Old Mill Road, formerly owned by my late grandmother, Eleanor Jenkins." She saw Silas stiffen. Sheriff Brody shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I am here tonight because I am a victim of criminal trespassing, property damage and intimidation, Sarah continued. My driveway has been blocked for 2 days, preventing my entry and exit. My fence lines have been illegally moved. And when I reported these crimes, your sheriff informed me it was a civil dispute and that he could do nothing. The room was now silent. All eyes were on her. Silas jumped to his feet, his face turning a deep, blotchy red. Now hold on a minute. That's a lie, he shouted at the council chairman. She's a stranger here from the city, coming in and telling lies to stir up trouble. I am not lying, Mr. Miller, Sarah said, turning to face him directly. The room was electric with tension. You told me, and I quote, "Black people don't rule here and that the land was yours despite my having the deed." My family has worked that land, Silas bellowed. You have no right. I have every right, Sarah said, her voice dropping, drawing everyone in. She opened the manila folder. I have the deed right here, properly recorded and legally binding. She held it up for a moment. But I find I don't need to show it to you, because I have something else. Something I think you'll find much more interesting. She slid a second, older document from the folder. It was yellowed with age, covered in faded cursive script. Some of the older folks here might remember Silas's father, Franklin Miller, Sarah said, her voice resonating with authority. And they might remember the bad harvest of '78, when many farms in this county nearly went under. Franklin was one of them. He was about to lose everything. Silas's face had gone from red to pale. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. But he was saved, Sarah said. A neighbor gave him a loan, a very generous loan with no interest, to be paid back in 5 years. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. That neighbor was my grandmother, Eleanor Jenkins. A collective gasp went through the room. Eleanor was a kind woman. When Franklin couldn't pay, she never called in the debt. She let it be, but she kept the paperwork. Sarah held up the old document. This is a promissory note, signed by Franklin Miller. It details the loan, and as collateral for that unpaid debt, it grants a lien on 20 acres of the Miller farm. Your prime pasture, Silas. The one right next to my property line. She looked directly at Silas, whose mouth was hanging open. He was speechless, utterly and publicly defeated. My grandmother never collected, Sarah finished, her voice cold as ice. But I am not my grandmother. The turning point wasn't just a revelation, it was a detonation. The power in the room had shifted completely. Part 6, 706 words. The silence that followed Sarah's words was absolute. It was heavier than the humid night air, thicker than the tension that had preceded it. Every person in the room, council members, farmers, the town clerk, was frozen, their eyes darting between the pale, trembling Silas and the composed woman at the podium. Sheriff Brody stared at his own hands on the table, as if he'd never seen them before. The legal document in Sarah's hand had not just changed the argument, it had rewritten the history of the two families in the minds of everyone present. Silas Miller, a man who had built his identity on bluster and intimidation, stood utterly exposed. He tried to speak, but only a dry, croaking sound came out. The public humiliation was a blow from which his reputation would never recover. He sank back into his chair, looking decades older than he had 10 minutes prior. Sarah watched him for a moment, then turned her attention to the council and the sheriff. She slid the promissory note back into its protective sleeve. I am not here to take anyone's land, she said, her voice firm but devoid of triumph. It was the voice of business. I am here to claim what is mine and to be left in peace. She looked directly at Sheriff Brody. I expect the tractor to be gone from my driveway when I return home tonight. I expect my property lines to be respected. And I expect any future attempts at intimidation to be met with the full force of the law. She then looked back at the shell-shocked Silas. Consider the matter of your father's debt settled. On one condition, you and your family will never set foot on my property again. This is the only warning you will receive. Without another word, she placed her documents back in her satchel, turned and walked out of the community hall. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The wave of her departure was more powerful than a shout. People didn't just see her as a landowner now. They saw her as a power player, someone who had outmaneuvered the town's biggest bully with intelligence and preparation. The drive home was quiet. The night seemed darker, the stars brighter. As she turned onto Old Mill Road, her headlights swept across her driveway. It was empty. The tractor was gone. A small, grim smile touched Sarah's lips. It wasn't joy, but it was satisfaction. The consequences of that night rippled through the community. Word of Silas Miller's public shaming spread like wildfire. The narrative changed instantly. Sarah was no longer the outsider from the city. She was Eleanor Jenkins's granddaughter, a woman who carried her family's legacy of quiet strength and hidden power. The whispers at the grocery store were now tinged with respect, even fear. Back at the Miller farm, the atmosphere was funereal. Silas had locked himself in his office. Jake found his mother sitting at the kitchen table, crying silently. He felt a profound sense of shame for his father, but also a sliver of relief. The ugly secret that had underpinned their family's prosperity was finally out, and the rot had been exposed. The confrontation at the meeting had irrevocably fractured his relationship with his father. He could no longer see him as a strong figure, only a petty, prejudiced thief who had been caught. The power dynamic within their own family had been shattered forever. Part 7. 715 words. Victory felt less like a celebration and more like the calm after a storm. The immediate threat was gone, but the landscape was altered. Sarah woke the next morning to a world that was quieter but also lonelier. The fight had given her a clear purpose. Now, in its absence, she was left with a rundown farmhouse, 100 acres of land she knew little about, and the looming question of what came next. The new challenge wasn't fighting an enemy, but building a future from the wreckage. Her growth began not with a grand decision, but with a small action. Instead of packing her bags to return to Charlotte, she pulled on a pair of work gloves and began clearing the overgrown weeds from her grandmother's front garden. The physical labor was grounding. With each weed she pulled, she felt like she was clearing away not just neglect, but the lingering shadow of Silas Miller's entitlement. She was claiming the land again, not with documents, but with her own 2 hands. This was a different kind of power. It was the power of creation, not confrontation. Her architect's mind, used to designing new structures, now focused on restoration. She saw the farmhouse not as a burden, but as her first independent project. She would restore it, honor its history, and make it her own. This shift from a defensive posture to a creative one was the core of her transformation. She was no longer just protecting her inheritance, she was inhabiting it. A few days later, a pickup truck she didn't recognize pulled into her now clear driveway. It was Mr. Henderson from the hardware store. "Figured you might need these," he said, unloading a set of post hole diggers and a roll of new wire. "Heard you had a fence needs mending." He also gave her the name of a reliable local handyman, a cousin of his who wouldn't be intimidated by the Millers. It was an act of community, a signal that she was being accepted. She hired the handyman, and together they began the slow process of repairing the house and properly marking the property lines. One afternoon, as she was measuring a window frame on the porch, Jake Miller appeared at the edge of her property. He stood there for a long time before finally walking up the drive. He looked thinner, and the confidence he once had, borrowed from his father, was gone. "Mom," he started, his voice quiet. "Mr. Henderson, he told me you were fixing the fence." Sarah stopped her work and looked at him. "That's right. I know you have no reason to want me here," he stammered, "but I know how to do this work. My dad, what he did was wrong, all of it. I want to make it right, not for him, for me. I'll work for free. Help you fix the fences, clear the fields, whatever you need." Sarah studied him for a long moment. She saw the genuine shame in his eyes. She saw a young man trying to unlearn a lifetime of his father's poison. Her first instinct was to refuse, to keep the clear line between her land and his. But she also saw an opportunity. Her grandmother had shown mercy to a Miller once. Perhaps she could show a different kind of it now, not forgiveness, but a chance for restitution. True strength wasn't just in winning battles, but in choosing how to build the peace afterward. "All right, Jake," she said slowly. "You can start tomorrow. 7 a.m. sharp. We're rebuilding the fence on the correct survey line." His shoulders sagged with relief. "Yes, ma'am, thank you." As he walked away, Sarah felt the final piece of her transformation click into place. She had come to Mason County to claim a piece of property. She was now on her way to reclaiming a piece of her family's history, and in the process building something new and entirely her own. She was no longer just a visitor. She was home. Is this section satisfactory? Would you like to make any adjustments, or can we proceed to the next one? Próximo eso pare cuando terminar. Aparte CTA com número de palavras correcto. show thinking excellent. We will now proceed with the final parts of the story, from the preparation for the climax to the concluding call to action. I will write continuously and only stop when the entire story is complete. Part 8, 711 words. The weeks that followed settled into a new kind of rhythm. Jake arrived every morning at sunrise, a silent and diligent worker. Together, he and Sarah tore down the old misplaced fence. The rhythmic thud of the post hole digger and the strain of stretching new wire became the soundtrack of their uneasy truce. It was a purely transactional relationship, built on the shared goal of correcting a wrong. Through their brief, work-focused conversations, Sarah learned more about the state of the Miller farm. Jake spoke of his father in hushed, pained tones. Silas had sold off most of his cattle and 2 of his 3 tractors. He spent his days in the house, the curtains drawn, drinking heavily. The public humiliation had festered into a poisonous, silent rage. Jake was no longer just atoning for his father's sins. He was actively managing a volatile and deteriorating man. This subplot of Jake's penance served to heighten the tension. Silas was not healing. He was festering. Sarah's presence in Mason County also became more permanent. She established a business account at Henderson's Hardware. She found the best day to buy fresh produce at the local market. The community's perception of her had solidified. She was no longer a curiosity, but a fixture, regarded with a cautious respect. She was the woman who had faced down Silas Miller and won. The secondary conflicts with the community and with Jake were resolving, turning all the narrative focus back to the dark cloud that lingered over the Miller farm. The work on the new fence was nearly complete. A sense of accomplishment and a fragile peace began to settle over Sarah's land. But the peace was soon disturbed. One morning, she found one of her new fence posts splintered, clearly struck by a heavy object. A few days later, she woke to find one of the tires on her SUV slashed. There was no proof, no one to accuse, but she knew. These were the cowardly acts of a man who had lost his power and was now resorting to petty sabotage. They were messages. She told Jake about the incidents, watching his reaction closely. A flicker of fear and deep sadness crossed his face. "I'll talk to him," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "That won't do any good, Jake, and you know it." The tension ratcheted up. The air grew thick with unspoken threats. Sarah began locking the doors to the farmhouse at night, something her grandmother had never done. She felt like she was living on the edge of a razor, waiting for the final desperate act from a broken man. The farm was becoming hers, the house was slowly being restored, but the shadow of her neighbor was a constant, oppressive weight. The story was accelerating toward its inevitable conclusion. The question was no longer if Silas would strike, but when and how. All the pieces were in place for one final confrontation. Part 9, 821 words. The climax arrived on a Tuesday, carried in by a dark, bruised-looking sky. The weather forecast had predicted the worst thunderstorm of the season, and the air was heavy and electric with anticipation. During the day, Sarah's kitchen faucet sputtered and went dry. When she went out to check the well, she found the pump's main electrical line had been deliberately cut, the copper wires snipped clean. This was different from the slashed tire or the broken fence post. This was not just intimidation, it was a direct attack on her survival, on her ability to live on the very land she had fought so hard for. The last thread of Sarah's patience snapped. Ignoring the darkening sky and the distant rumble of thunder, she got in her car and drove straight to the Miller farm. She didn't call the sheriff, this was between her and Silas. She pulled up to the large, dilapidated barn and saw a dim light glowing from within. She slid the heavy barn door open. Silas was inside, illuminated by a single bare bulb. He was surrounded by greasy engine parts and the last of his farming equipment. An open bottle of whiskey sat on a workbench beside him. He looked up as she entered, and his eyes, bloodshot and filled with hate, fixed on her. "Finally decided to come crawling back?" he slurred, a cruel smile on his face. "You cut the line to my well, Silas," Sarah said, her voice devoid of fear. It was cold, hard, and sharp as a shard of glass. "That land should be mine," he roared, standing up and grabbing a heavy iron tire iron from the bench. "My daddy and his daddy worked this county. We built this place. You city people, you're kind. You come in, and you think you can just take it all." He took a menacing step toward her, but Sarah didn't flinch. The woman who had calmly faced him at the county council meeting was gone. In her place was a woman pushed past her limit. "Your father was a debtor who was saved by my grandmother's kindness," she shot back, her voice rising to match his. "You are a thief who tried to steal her legacy. You didn't build anything. You've spent your life feeding on the scraps of better people, convincing yourself it was a feast. You didn't lose your farm to me. You lost it the moment you decided your hate was worth more than your honor." As Silas raised the tire iron, the barn door slid open further. Jake stood there, his face pale, rain beginning to soak his shirt. "Dad, no!" Silas hesitated, looking from Sarah to his son. "Stay out of this, boy. She's the reason we're ruined." This was the lie he had been telling himself for weeks, but it was about to be destroyed. "No, she's not," Jake said, his voice shaking but clear. This was the moment his own transformation became visible. "I called the bank, Dad, this morning. I asked them about the loans." This was the final, unexpected blow. It wasn't about Sarah's documents or her grandmother's past. It was about Silas's own hidden failures. "They told me everything," Jake continued, tears welling in his eyes. "The second mortgage in 2018, the defaults on the equipment loans last year. You were already going under. You were weeks from foreclosure before she even showed up." The tire iron slipped from Silas's fingers and clattered onto the concrete floor. The truth hit him with the force of a physical blow, shattering the last of his pride. He wasn't a king dethroned by an enemy. He was a failure who had been looking for someone to blame. Sarah hadn't ruined him. She had simply been the one to hold up a mirror. As the first crash of thunder shook the barn and the rain began to pour down in sheets, Silas Miller collapsed onto an old hay bale, a broken man, finally defeated by a truth he could no longer deny. Sarah looked at him, then at Jake. She gave a single sharp nod, turned, and walked out into the storm, leaving the son to deal with the ruins of his father. Part 10, 605 words. The storm that night washed the world clean. The next morning, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The air felt fresh and new. Sarah paid for a rush job to have the well pump repaired, the cost a small price for the finality it represented. News traveled fast in Mason County. Within a week, a foreclosure notice was officially posted on the gate of the Miller farm. The property was seized by the bank. Silas was gone. Some said he left in the middle of the night to stay with a distant relative. No one knew for sure. He had simply vanished, his legacy reduced to whispers and a cautionary tale. With Silas gone, the oppressive shadow that had hung over Sarah's land finally lifted. The farm felt truly hers for the first time. The quiet was no longer menacing, it was peaceful. A few weeks later, Sarah sat on her newly painted porch on the phone with her boss in Charlotte. The final plans for the big downtown project were on her laptop screen. "So you'll be back on Monday?" her boss asked. Sarah looked out over the fields where new grass was beginning to grow. She saw the sturdy new fence line, a clear and definite boundary. She thought of the restored woodwork in the farmhouse and the scent of lavender that still lingered in the air. "Actually, Robert," she said, a sense of calm certainty in her voice, "I won't be coming back. I'm resigning." Her arc was complete. She had come to North Carolina to secure an inheritance, a piece of property. She was leaving with something far more valuable, a purpose. She realized her skills as an architect were not just for designing steel and glass towers in the city. They could be used here to restore and rebuild, to honor the history of places like her grandmother's farm. Her conclusion was not to run back to the life she knew, but to build a new one from the foundation she had fought for. She decided to open a small, independent practice out of the farmhouse, specializing in the restoration of historic rural homes. Jake Miller's arc also found its conclusion. He didn't leave town. Instead, he took a job as a hired hand on a neighboring farm, one that had no quarrel with Sarah. He was starting from the bottom, building a reputation based on his own hard work, not his family name. One day, he stopped his truck on the road by her farm. He didn't come onto the property, but he got out and gave her a nod from the fence line. It was a gesture of respect, an acknowledgement of the boundaries she had set and the peace she had earned. Sarah nodded back, a silent understanding passing between them. The cycle of debt and animosity was over. Epilogue, 398 words. 2 years later, the Jenkins farm was unrecognizable. The farmhouse was a pearl-white gem, its porch decorated with blooming flowers. A discreet, professionally carved wooden sign near the driveway read, "Jenkins Historic Restorations." Sarah's business was a success. She had found a niche, helping other families in the county bring their old homes back to life, preserving a piece of their own history. She had become a part of the community, not by force, but by contribution. She was a regular at the town council meetings, but now she spoke about building permits and historical preservation grants. She had even helped organize a local co-op for the smaller farms, giving them better leverage to sell their produce. Mr. Henderson was her first and most enthusiastic member. One warm autumn afternoon, Sarah sat on her porch swing, a glass of iced tea sweating in her hand. She was looking over architectural drafts for her latest project. The silence was comfortable, filled with the hum of a prosperous and peaceful life. A truck slowed on the road and she saw Jake at the wheel. He had his own small landscaping business now, and his truck looked new. He gave her a friendly wave and she waved back. There was no tension, no lingering ghosts of the past. There was only the quiet respect of two people who had survived a storm and found their own way on the other side. Sarah leaned her head back, closing her eyes. She had come to Mason County seeking justice for her grandmother and had found it. But in the process she had found something more important: a home. She had proven that you don't need to be born in a place to belong to it. Sometimes belonging is something you build yourself with courage, integrity, and a clear, unshakable sense of who you are. The land was not just her inheritance, it was her future. CTA, 198 words. Sarah's story shows that true strength isn't just in fighting back, but in having the vision to build something better in its place. Her courage and intelligence didn't just win her a piece of land, they rewrote her family's future and reshaped a community. Justice, in the end, was not just about winning, but about building a lasting peace. If you watched until the end and were inspired by Sarah's journey, let us know in the comments by writing, "I watched to the end." Your support and engagement help us to find and share more powerful stories of resilience and justice just like this one. And your journey doesn't have to end here. There's another incredible story of triumph over prejudice waiting for you. Click the video that's appearing on your screen right now, and we'll see you there for another story that needs to be told.